So next up, podcast listeners, voter ID does not work for the trans community. I thought I've heard everything. So transgender activists cry foul on voter ID. Can't make this up. Before the 2022 midterm elections, transgender activists worry that voter ID laws, which require citizens to show state-issued identification cards, like your driver's license, pretty straightforward, in order to be able to cast a ballot. Trans activists believe it will force them to associate with their birth names and biological sex. Oh, gosh. The complaint from far-left ideologues, though complex in its jargon, comes down to a simple point. People who drastically alter their appearance, change their names, and choose new pronouns often face difficulties in proving their legal identity. Imagine that. Imagine that. You change your name and you change the way you look and you do everything you can to make everybody else as confused as you certainly appear. And then you're shocked that people don't and can't identify you when you try to vote or, try to cash a check. Henry Seaton, a female, who presents herself as a male, said she faced this discrimination when she tried to vote at a church outside of Nashville, Tennessee in 2016, NBC News reported. Of course, naturally, she tried to vote in a church. Seaton changed her legal name to Henry, but the government-issued ID still correctly identified her as a female, because she still is a female. The poll workers felt understandable confusion and asked Henry to explain the situation. Quote, "I had to out myself as transgender," said Seaton. Can you imagine? I had to out myself as transgender. I'm pretty sure people can tell. Okay. Right, Chris? Can't you tell?
Depends.
Yeah, like Saturday Night Live used to have Pat on there, and Pat was always like, you could never tell, whether Pat was a guy or a girl. Of course, Saturday Night Live could never do that now. But, quote, "I had to out myself as transgender," said Seaton, a 24-year-old transgender justice advocate at the American Civil Liberties Union of Tennessee. So this is now part of justice, right? Being able to vote and confusing the folks working the polls because all they're trying to do is to verify your identity. And somehow they're the bad people. People who suffer from gender dysphoria, like Seaton, report experiencing anxiety and trauma when forced to reveal their legal name and sex. Seaton said revealing himself to be a male, well, Seaton, of course, is a girl, is a female, and revealing herself to be a male, although I'm just reading the article the way they have it written, can be brutally dangerous, especially where I was living, which is a conservative suburb. Of course, by the way, it's your choice to live in that conservative suburb, okay? No one's making you live there. But naturally, if you're an activist, which this individual is, for the American Civil Liberties Union, and you live in a conservative suburb of Tennessee, which is probably very likely, it's in Tennessee, that it's going to be conservative, you shouldn't be really surprised. So, of course, Seaton never claimed that anyone actually threatened him. So there you go. No one threatened the guy. All they were doing is just asking questions. When Henry went to the polls and tried to vote, and they asked Henry what for his ID, and Henry shows his ID, and the ID says, well, Henry is a woman. And so the poll watchers and the folks that are working there were like, well, then can you explain this? Because you don't necessarily look like the picture, and the sex thing looks like it's a little off. It's, quote, just not embarrassing, but it's terrifying to have to do that, to try to read the room and see, like, are they going to kick me out? It can be dehumanizing to have your whole identity nitpicked just so that you can cast your ballot and have your voice be heard, he said. The left has decided to put transgender people alongside poor and black people who now claim they cannot access voter IDs. So, how you like that? So in the Maryland House of Delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I served on a committee for 4 years called the Ways and Means Committee. And one of the things that it covered, and still does, is election laws. You know, how do you make elections better? Since the Democrats control the legislature, they always make elections less secure because that's what Democrats do, and that is a fact. We have heard in that committee, and I heard in that committee, so many bills about voter ID, making voter ID compulsory, making it the law of the state. And invariably, we would have people come up and testify who would say, and it was hard to believe they could do it with a straight face. They would testify and say, well, black and brown people can't get IDs, and therefore voter ID is discriminating. I kid you not. And so then we would have folks from the state's election board present because they would always show up and watch the hearings since it would obviously impact their responsibilities in running elections. And I remember asking them in committee, isn't it so that in Maryland, if you can't afford to purchase an ID, the state will pay for the ID and provide it to you for free? And the answer was, yeah, we do that all the time. So once again, if you cannot drive because you don't have a car or you can't afford to drive, and therefore you don't have a driver's license, the state will issue an ID that looks just like the driver's license, but it's just not a permission to drive. But it looks the exact same way. It's the same size and everything. I think that's $25 or thereabouts. And if you still can't afford that, the state will provide it to you for free because the idea is, well, you need to probably go cash your checks from the various welfare agencies. You may have food stamps. You may need an ID for all kinds of reasons. Duh, of course you do. And so the left always would come to the Ways and Means Committee and say, nope, voter ID discriminates against black and brown people. And now the left has found a brand new way to fight voter ID. Well, trans people shouldn't be required to show their voter ID because it discriminates against trans people. In other words, voter ID laws disproportionately impact trans people. Fancy words, right? Disproportionately impact. And we've also heard the same thing about folks who are homeless. I've actually heard testimony from folks who work in homeless communities. They are not themselves homeless, but they work in homeless shelters, and they say, well, ID laws are wrong because homeless people can't vote. Can you imagine? Once again, the state will provide an ID for you for free. But many of these individuals could care less about voting. I'm talking about the homeless, and I'm sure some do, but they can get that ID for free. And the fact of the matter is, the Democrats are just shameless when they talk about this issue. And now they're using the trans issue. In my state, ladies and gentlemen, and this has happened in other blue states, in my state, you can go change your birth certificate retroactively. Think about that. You can identify as another sex. Of course, I'm sure the Democrats would love it, but that's probably coming next, by the way. Not that you just change your sex from male to female or female to male, but that there's a third choice, right? And that might actually be the law now. I'm not really sure. I have to really look that up if there's an other, because it wouldn't surprise me. But already in my state and in many blue states, it is already the law that you can change your birth certificate. Now, the left, I think they were probably playing the long game. And the long game was, you know what, why don't we do this with this whole trans thing to try to make it impossible to verify elections? Because before it was black and brown, and that's obviously getting really stupid sounding now. Black and brown people can't afford to have an ID, and therefore they should not be forced to bring it because it requires too much work to bring your ID when you go vote. And they don't want you to vote in person, and we all know why that is. So to prove this point, ladies and gentlemen, we have a clip from NBC. All right, and NBC, you have the two anchors in the morning talking about how voter ID laws disproportionately impact trans people. And we have this clip, and it's just shameless. And here's the clip.
Voters are concerned they might be blocked from casting their ballots.
Yeah, that's because a growing number of states are enforcing stricter voter identification laws that disproportionately impact the community.
NBC Out reporter Joe Yerkeba joins us now with more on this. Joe, good morning to you. So first of all, how can voter ID laws create obstacles for transgender people? And where do we see some of the strictest voter ID laws?
Sure, yeah. So voter ID laws disproportionately impact trans people because trans people are more likely to have IDs without the name that they go by and the gender marker that reflects how they present. And recent research shows that just over 200,000 eligible trans voters in 31 states that both conduct their elections mostly in person and require or request ID at the polls don't have IDs that reflect their gender identities and the names they go by. And the states that have the strictest voter ID laws are mostly concentrated in the South and Midwest. So Tennessee, Wisconsin, Kansas. So voters there are going to be.
So NBC News, a major news outlet saying voter ID is bad because trans people should not be required to provide their voter ID. And we have the most extreme versions of voter ID laws in, of course, those Republican states. So here's an idea, ladies and gentlemen. Here's a great compromise, which, by the way, I will ask you to ask yourself, do you think Democrats would ever go for this? So hear me out on this voter ID stuff. I have a Mac laptop, which I love. Okay, I love Mac products. Let's face it, the stuff works really well. I don't get very many viruses. And the reason I like my Mac laptop as well is because there's a fingerprint option on here, and you just put your fingerprint on the Mac, and the Mac, of course, opens to your apps and remembers your gazillion passwords that you have for all the different things that you need to access. So if a trans activist doesn't want to use their ID, then why don't we have the same kind of fingerprint scanning at the polls? You walk up and they say, "Name, sir," or maybe they're afraid of saying "sir" because of, name. Just name now. Name. And the person gives their name, your address. And the person gives their address. Great. Now, would you like to show your ID, or would you like for us to scan your fingerprint? Now, I have no problem showing my ID. Between you and me, I prefer not to have my fingerprint out there, of course, other than on my Mac. And even then, that makes me a little skittish, admittedly. But at least it's an option, right? I still have an option of showing my ID, and they match the ID up with the address that's in their poll books. And they look at my picture. Yep, that's him. That's good. And then they could even take my ID and say, "When were you born, sir?" They can do one of those extra questions. Okay, fine. You're good to go. Go vote. Here's your ballot. Go mark it. And for the trans people, and for people who are black and brown, who apparently, according to the Democrats, can't bring their ID because it's discriminatory because they don't have one. And for the homeless, just have them use their fingerprint if they can't get an ID or if they do not want to use their ID. How about that for a solution? And now we know exactly whether or not that person voted and whether or not it was the correct person that voted. People, Chris said, yeah, people that don't have fingers, you're discriminating against them. Toe print. I don't know. Okay. I know. It's just like, we live in this period in American history and world history where technology has advanced to the point that there are easy things that we can do to help people who feel like they are marginalized so that they can still vote in person, which they should be required to vote in person, and still feel that they don't have to reveal their identity if they're trans, number one, and number two, that they don't have to go through the effort, even though the state will pay for their ID, of getting an ID. So it's just a simple fingerprint. So it's either or, not both. And as I said, I think most people would still prefer, especially Republican voters, would still prefer to just show their ID because I think most Republicans are concerned about security. They just assume not have their fingerprint out there. But you see what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen? There's always a way to fix this problem. Or we just treat everybody the same, which is everybody has to show an ID. Okay? That's probably the best way. But we have NBC News. And of course, we have not only NBC News, but all of the woke big corporations, NBC, which is Comcast Universal, and ABC and CBS and CNN and MSNBC, who are literally going down this road. And these are the same people who are saying to you that you are an election denier when all you are asking is for elections to be the day of voting and early voting as well, but must be in person, and you must show your voter ID. And then I think you'd have a general consensus with Republicans and most unaffiliated voters, and as well as I'm hoping at least some Democrat voters who would say, yeah, that actually seems reasonable. And in those unique situations where you have that trans voter, then fine, give them some other option, but you still need to verify who they are, because they don't get to skirt the law. They don't. They still have to follow the law. Stop asking for everybody to give you a pass with the law. It applies to you too. All laws are supposed to be applied equally.